Hey there, good people of the world. Big Heavy, back from a fantastic weekend of camping at the incomparable Dreher Island State Park in the fair state of South Carolina. Highly recommend it if you ever happen to be in that area. Great camping right in the water, great fishing, and it's getting around to be one of my favorite times of year in the southeastern United States, where it's not 6 billion degrees with 9,000% humidity, and it's actually quite tolerable and quite delightful to be outside. But you probably didn't come here to hear about my camping trip. You probably came here to hear my field report on the Ecoflow Delta 2. So this is the new power bank from Ecoflow. It's a little over 1,000 watt hours of power. It's got some great connectivity features, really nice selection of outputs. But if you want all the specs and want to take an exhaustive look at the device itself, I have a full review that's probably going to be somewhere right about there. And this is more about actual hands-on use in the field. And for me, field is typically taking out on a camping trip. I have a 12-volt refrigerator made by Iceco that I've reviewed at some other point, and I'll flap that up above my head somewhere. Really like that unit. Makes for kind of a game-changing car camping experience when you're able to have food that stays cold more or less indefinitely without ending up after a couple or 3 days of having, the weird sea of floating bologna and gloopy, stinky juice of melted ice kind of floating around in there. So that's typically what I'll bring on a car camping trip, and I'll also charge my phones a couple or 3 times along the way, and that's kind of what I mean by taking a device out in the field. This is by no means a laboratory grade test scenario. There's at least a couple dozen factors I can think of that would affect the battery performance in this type of situation, everything from ambient temperature to whether the cooler is kept in the sun to what kind of food you have in that cooler could affect its performance and hence its energy demands. But I do think you learn a few things out in the field. In this case, I learned one fairly important thing that I wanted to share with you. But first, let's get to the high-level results. So we went out, started our camping trip, probably arrived at camp around 7-ish on Friday afternoon. The Delta 2 was fully charged. I generally set up my power bank in the back of my F-150 where I have power outlets. I have the newer Power Boost truck, so I have 4 AC outlets that put out a pretty significant amount of energy. They were able to supply the full 1,200 watts to charge the Delta 2 while we were driving down. And the one nuance that I'll talk about a little bit more is when we got to camp, I discovered that the cooler had turned off and it had an E1 error. That error generally indicates that the cooler's detected it wasn't getting enough power through the 12 volt and kind of shut itself off. The intent there, and most of the 12 volt coolers have this feature, is it's designed to sense when voltage drops below a certain level, and it assumes that your battery in your vehicle that you've plugged the device into is dying. So it stops cooling under the assumption that it's better to have a cooler full of bad food than it is to be out somewhere in the remote wilderness and have a vehicle that won't start and end up stranded. I thought that was a little odd. I've never seen that happen with the Iceco, aside from some weird scenarios where I was sort of goofing around. Kind of wrote it off basically when we got to camp. So I was able to restart the cooler. I turned the Delta 2 on and off, and everything seemed to be working fine. So set up the cooler, 100% battery in the Delta 2. The Iceco was up at about 50 degrees. I generally keep it set at 36-ish when I'm out camping. So the Delta 2 had to do a little bit of work to get the cooler cooled down again, since I had to take it from 50 back down to 36. We woke up fairly early the next morning, so probably went to bed, checked the cooler, made sure everything was working around 10:30-ish. Woke up around 5:45 because we were going fishing, and I was a little bit surprised and somewhat unhappy to find that the Iceco was completely turned off. I sort of whacked all the buttons on the Delta 2, things seemed to get going again, and was a little bit concerned, but ultimately we went off on our fishing trip, and I didn't really think about it till we got back from the fishing trip, and again the cooler was sitting there and was totally powered off. At this point I figured I'd take out the app and see if I could debug what was going on. I was a little concerned that there was some sort of problem with the Delta 2's outputs. I was using the 12 volt automotive style plug in the back, and when I went into the app I discovered what folks at the tech support help desk I worked at back when I was an intern in my college days would have called an ID10T error. And yes, if you can't figure that out based on what's on the screen, that's the code you would put in a trouble ticket when the person you were talking to was indeed a complete idiot. And in my case, arguably one could consider it user error, you could consider it abject stupidity. As usual, when I'm going on a camping trip on a Friday, I'm trying to finish up work, I'm trying to wrangle kids, trying to get to the grocery store and do all those hundreds of things that one normally does before they go on a long trip. And as usual, I'd sort of thrown the cooler in at the last minute, As usual, I'd also plug the cooler into AC in the house and load it up with all the groceries and let it come down to temperature for several hours before leaving, which I think is always a good idea, specifically in case the situation I'm about to describe happens to you. But I'd never gone into the Ecoflow app. And I don't know if this is a default setting. I don't know if it loads these defaults when you first connect the app to the device. I'm not sure how it got there. It may very well have been me playing with the different settings when I was reviewing the unit and kind of testing out the app. But for some reason, I had set the Delta 2 to automatically power off after 2 hours. And I also had, I believe, an hour or 2 hour timeout on the 12-volt output. So when I got to camp and found the cooler in that E1 state and kind of quickly checked the app before going and setting up all the tents and doing all that stuff, I noticed the auto timeout for the Delta 2 itself and had fixed that. The next morning was again a little bit surprised to find the cooler not working, and after we got back from the fishing trip, discovered that timeout setting on the 12-volt output and fixed that. So the upshot of this review is that I should have paid more attention. Yes, I'm probably an idiot. And yes, a fair case could probably be made that that was 100% user error, which is absolutely the case. The Delta 2 did nothing wrong other than following the settings I had put in there. But the punchline of this story is if you get one of these Delta 2 units, if you do decide to set it up with the app, and again, I'm not sure if this is a default setting in the app or this is something I had played with, but each of the specific outputs actually has its own timeout timer in addition to the overall unit, in addition to the display on the unit. So you could theoretically have the display turn off after 5 minutes, you could have the USB outputs turn off after 1 hour, you could have the AC outputs turn off after 5 hours, and you could have the 12-volt outputs in the back turn off after some other interim time, and then have the overall unit shut off at a completely different time. So upside is there's tons of configurability to this unit. The downside is if you're not careful about your settings, you may end up being out in the field, you may end up at night or something like that and having things turn off that you don't want to turn off. Thankfully for us, the temperatures were cool enough that the cooler never really got above 50, never really had any risk of food spoilage, and I finally figured it out Saturday morning and got everything squared away. Sunday morning when we were ready to shove off, I checked the unit once again and was pleasantly surprised to find there was about 30% battery left. I think these 1,000 watt-hour battery banks are kind of the perfect weekender type battery bank. I didn't do any charging during the time we were there. You normally, if we were out for more than 2 nights, when we started getting to 3-4 nights, I would bring a solar panel, or I would plan on plugging the unit into my vehicle and charging it up a little bit during the course of the weekend. But in this case, finishing with just shy of a third of a battery after 2 nights of camping was pretty impressive. And in terms of the devices I was running over the weekend, I was running the 12-volt fridge. Those are kind of notoriously hard to determine how much power it uses over the course of the weekend. Again, this is an unscientific field report. I find the Iceco generally pulls 40 to 60 watts when it's cooling, but it's not running all the time. Again, depending on what's in there, depending on ambient temperature, all that. Probably charged up 3 iPhones during the course of the weekend. I had my phone on there a couple times. My wife charged up her phone. My son had one of his friends here and he charged up his phone. So overall, ending with a third of the battery after doing that type of weekend workload, I was pretty happy with. I was also very happy with figuring out those various auto timeouts once I finally cleared my ID10 error and realized the error of my ways, so to speak. And I did find that app was helpful. It was nice to be able to configure the display settings on there. I had set it to keep the display on indefinitely. It is rather bright in a dark campsite. So the ability to change the timeout to 1 minute when you're out in the field is pretty handy. On the return trip back home, I did my usual configuration, had the cooler in the back of the F-150, had the cooler connected to the power bank, which was then plugged in the back of the truck. After 2 minutes after we started up the truck and kind of were heading down the road, I saw that full 1200 watt draw from the dashboard of the F-150, so it was able to supply the kind of full demand of the Delta 2. Delta 2 was able to take as much electricity as it could get and jam that into the battery. And when I got home, I had a fully charged Delta 2. I had an ice-cold Iceco. Didn't have any problems, so that seems to me to indicate that all my errors and the Iceco being shut down and all that stuff was due to having configured some of those timeouts on the outputs. So punchline of this, so far very successful on initial weekend outing with the Delta 2. There wasn't any fan noise or anything like that when it was powering the cooler. Everything was quiet at night in the camp. I can kind of vaguely hear the cooler if I'm listening to it, but it's a generally fairly pleasant noise, so one of those that kind of fades into the background, and didn't hear the Delta 2 or anything like that kick in over the course of any of the evenings we were out there. Kept everything cool, ended with a third of a battery as I mentioned. Again, ambient air temperature was probably about 85 at its highest, probably 55, 60 at night. So not a particularly strenuous environment for the cooler, but I think the Delta 2 could either make it for maybe a 3-night trip if you're willing to maybe avoid some of the phone charges in those types of temperatures, or in warmer temperatures, you'd probably be okay for a couple nights as long as you got a little supplemental power in there. So overall, once I cleared my idiot error, very pleased with the Delta 2's performance. Again, I think it's a pretty nice size. You know, I do like that you can either carry it like the large kettlebell, or you can one-hand it relatively easily. It is fairly awkward to carry in a one-hand manner over long distances. We were camping, it was 50 feet or so to the car, but down a rather steep hill, and wouldn't want to have to carry it much longer than that one-handed. You could probably go a little longer in that two-hand configuration, but it would consume both your hands, obviously, which might be a challenge when you're setting things up. So with that, I will say thank you for watching. I will have some more power bank related content coming up. I'm going to do a little solar panel testing with the Delta 2. I've got some other solar stuff up my sleeve, as well as some gas generators, which is new for my channel. And I'll also get back to some of the truck content and other low-grade nonsense and tomfoolery that hopefully keeps you sticking around for more. And with that, this is the Big Heavy wishing you well in whatever endeavors you pursue, and signing off. Peace. Ever wonder why every talking head on YouTube asks you to hit the like and subscribe button at the end of their video? You were right, because we're living in a computer simulation. And our benevolent robotic overlords get just a little bit of energy every time you hit that like. So do me, the rest of civilization, and our benevolent robotic overlords a favor. Mash that subscribe, be kind to each other, keep living your simulated dreams.